Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. My name is Kevbot, and in today's video, I'm going to be refilming the earliest video on my channel. On March 20th, 2024, I uploaded this video detailing the build process for my gaming table. Although I'm really proud of this video and the table I built, I'm not super happy with the audio and visual quality of it. Now that I have a better camera and microphone, I decided to recreate it with the original script and footage, just reshooting the parts of me speaking. I've unlisted the original version, although it can be found at the link in the comments if you want to check it out. However, with that said, we've got a lot to cover today, so let's get right on into it. Before we get into the build itself, I wanted to go over what I've been using as a gaming table, because in a large way, it inspired some key details that I wanted to incorporate into my build. This actually started years ago with the setup that I used when I was living and playing D&D in China that worked really well. We combined 4 folding tables, 2 6-foot tables side by side for the players to sit around, 1 4-foot table laying perpendicular at the end for the DM to put all of his stuff on, and 1 4-foot table on top of the 6-foot tables with the wet erase battle map. I loved this setup for several reasons. Firstly, because it uses folding tables, it's ultra portable and can be easily set up and taken down in minutes. This is a good solution if you're someone who's looking for a big gaming table, but for whatever reason can't have a permanent fixture. Secondly, there's so much space for the players to fit comfortably around it. At one point, we had 8 players, plus the DM, and had enough space for everyone. And speaking of space, the DM has tons of space, with the whole table to himself. But I think the biggest piece of inspiration that would carry from this setup to the build is the amount of space in the player part around the table, and separation from the battle map in the middle. As you can see in these photos, there's more than enough room around the edges for character sheets, books, dice, minis, drinks, food, and whatever else we wanted at the table. But I'll come back to that point later on in the design process. When the world ended in 2020, I decided to come back home, but brought essentially the exact same table design and setup with me. The only difference is I shifted from player to DM and ended up running campaign modules, namely Lost Mines of Phandelver and Icewind Dale Rime of the Frost Maiden. So because I was running these pre-written modules, I wanted to take full advantage of the included battle maps. Of the main pillars of D&D, my favorite pillar of the game is definitely exploration, both as a player and as a DM. I love revealing paths and passages as the party explores whatever area they're in. How did I accomplish this? Well, I would enlarge the map to full 1-inch grid size, print it off, cut out all the pieces of the map, and then tape them all together. Then, I could lay out individual pieces of the map as the party explored different areas. Generally speaking, this worked well, but there were some major downsides. Firstly, the printing. This process would often result in needing to print anywhere from 80 to 120 full-color pages of maps for a single dungeon. Secondly, the time. Printing, cutting, and taping would take hours, especially for the bigger maps like Caves of Hunger from Icewind Dale, which, full size, literally took up my entire kitchen at the time. Finally, it could be a bit clunky during actual playtime if I lost pieces and had to look for them, or if pieces of the map got knocked around the table while players moved their minis around. At the end of the day, this process still had more positives than negatives, but all of that changed when I changed careers. See, I was teaching at the time and had access to a full-color printer to print all the pages. When I decided to change careers, I now no longer had access to a printer, so I needed a solution. And the solution was to build a table. Well, the solution to the problem is actually to use the TV to display and reveal the maps instead of paper. But I didn't want to simply build a TV box and put it on top of the existing folding tables. I've seen other tables that do this, and functionally it works fine. But I feel like the sightlines are thrown off having the TV elevated like this, something that I would test later and would turn out to be the case. I needed the TV nested into the table itself so players could look down on the TV and have better sightlines. So my 2 main goals for this project essentially became number 1, rebuild what I currently have out of wood, and number 2, put a TV into it. Easy enough, right? This leads me to my first big tip. If you want to build your own custom gaming table, but you're also a big idiot like me who doesn't really know what he's doing, get inspired by what other people have already done to decide what you want to do for the table, along with what you don't want. Once you've decided that, make your design with those factors in mind. I already decided that I needed to have a TV in my table. So consider what your needs are. Do you need a TV? If so, what size? What about a projector instead? Or no visual display surface? If so, will your tabletop have felt on it? Or a whiteboard top with a grid? Something else entirely? There's no one answer when you're building a custom table. Just consider whatever your specific group's needs are. Along with the TV, the second thing my table needed was to have enough space around it for players to at least fit their character sheets and books. This meant the player space needed to be at least 11 inches long. Again, looking at other tables for inspiration, some tables will look like they have the space, and some tables clearly don't. In my mind, the most infamous gaming tables when it comes to this are the wormwood tables. They are absolutely beautiful tables, and if you're using them for things like board games, then the rail that they do have is completely appropriate. But I have no idea how players feel comfortable playing TTRPGs around these. Sure, they have magnetic attachments that help to mitigate this, but for my purposes, it was better to just have it built into the table itself. The third thing that I wanted to incorporate was extra storage space for the players. Many of my players use spell cards, token sets, minis, and that's on top of the standard accessories, such as dice, rolling trays, character sheets, and reference books. So for this, I was inspired by Nerd Immersion's build that has shelving units all around the table. I love the look of this and definitely wanted to implement it in my table, but I knew I wouldn't be able to do the extra cubbies on the legs because this leads me to my fourth and final point of inspiration for the table. The last thing I wanted to do for this design was to have the entire table sitting on a central base instead of a traditional table with 4 legs. This idea came to me from my friend Russ, and I basically did it for the exact same reasons that he lays out in his video. Even though there are 6 spots on the table that are clearly designed for different players to sit at during D&D sessions, and I never really DM for more than 6 players at a time, I wanted there to be space for more than 6 people, so you can sit around the table anywhere. This would lead to more flexibility for using the table to play games other than D&D. So, those are all the aspects that I for sure wanted. But equally important is to consider the things that you don't want to design in your table. I saw lots of tables with built-in cup holders, dice trays, rolling towers, and all of that looked neat, but I didn't want to build it into my table. In my mind, it's a lot of extra work for cup holders when drinks have never usually been an issue for us in the past, and dice trays that my players never use anyways. Now that I felt confident in the different aspects of the table, it was time to start building. A competent carpenter would be able to use proper design software and skills to design the table. But, seeing as how I am neither competent nor a carpenter, my plan was to start with the TV and work outwards from there. 2 key factors are the TV and having it all supported on a central base. So, I decided to start building the central base around the TV to get my measurements and then design out from there. I was able to get a good Boxing Day deal on a 58-inch TV. But if you can't find a good deal at your local electronics dealer, try looking for a good deal on a used TV. One key aspect to consider is the size of the TV. Intuitively, one might think bigger is always better, because bigger TVs means bigger battle maps. And while this is technically true, remember that bigger TVs means that it's harder for players and dungeon masters to reach all areas of it. I would actually even say that 58 inches is too big, but I knew that part of the tabletop would rest on it anyways, making the functional TV smaller. In my case, it makes the TV around 50 inches in size. Me personally, I think that 48 inches is the perfect size for a gaming TV. I wouldn't go bigger than 55 inches, but something to consider depending on what your group needs are, before buying a TV for the table. Once the TV arrived, I laid it flat on the ground, with the screen facing down, and measured the distance around it, for building the supporting box. I built the supporting box out of 2x12 dimensional lumber. Now, if I were building a TV box, This size of lumber would definitely be overkill and pretty awkward and heavy. However, for my table, this box would not only support the TV, but also support the whole tabletop. So I wanted it to be as strong as possible. I still probably could have gotten away with 2x10s or 2x8s in this design, but better safe than sorry. Importantly, in this step, I had to measure and cut out areas of the box where the speakers, fans, and remote sensors are. Having these areas exposed allow for sound, help prevent the TV from overheating, and lets me turn it on with the remotes. All important things. For the back supports, I basically just laid them onto the TV and then screwed them into place where they sit. Cutting off an area for either a speaker or ventilation, not quite sure. One reason why I laid the TV flat on the ground is because the backs of all TVs have weird curves and bends to them. This guarantees that when I flip it over, the TV will lay flat in the box. You'll notice that the back of the supports are more near the middle of the TV than the edges, and that was on purpose. The top of the TV curves up sharply, so I wouldn't get as strong a contact there, as opposed to where the top piece sits, where the back of the TV flattens out a bit. And for the bottom piece, there's a whole line of speakers and ventilation that would have to be cut out. The more that these back supports get cut out, the less support they will end up giving. And with that, the TV box is done. As anticipated, the TV sits flat into it, and I screwed the plexiglass sheet on top of the TV. This is optional, especially considering how expensive plexiglass can be, but I recommend it. It helps to stop the TV from getting scratched, it's easy to clean, and you can write on it with dry erase markers, if so desired. With how the supports are placed, there's tons of space to run the back power and HDMI cables out the back. I plugged it in for a quick test, and it works. I actually ran a couple of D&D sessions with this setup to test it out a bit, and it worked really well. Of course, as expected, the sightlines are not good, with the box sitting this high up, and the players often had to stand up to see what was displayed on the TV. Part of this has to do with the fact that I used 12-inch dimensional lumber, and had I used 8-inch or even 6-inch dimensional lumber instead, it wouldn't have been as big of an issue. But it will still be resolved once the table is completely done. Feeling confident with the progress so far, it was now time to design and fabricate the table itself. First, the center TV box would sit on fence posting, elevating it off the ground. I chose fence posting because I knew it would be more than strong enough to support the entire weight of the table, and the square nature of them makes them easy to design around and screw into. Then, I would surround 3 of the sides with 1/2-inch plywood, doing a plunge cut on one of the long sides to allow for that breathing space for the TV, where I cut into the TV box. I wouldn't need to surround the 4th side facing the DM, because that would be covered up with the DM section anyways. This would help to keep costs lower, and actually help with easier access to the back of the TV and underneath the table. For the tabletop, I would cut 2 U-shaped pieces of plywood, one top piece and one bottom piece, so I could frame in the shelving part around the table. I decided that it would be a good idea to just frame the shelving with 5-inch strips of 1/2-inch plywood. This turned out to be a bad idea. At one point in the build process, I was warned that this was a bad idea, but I ignored this warning. Ignoring this warning was also a bad idea, but we'll get to that later. Anyways, the top piece would be 11 inches wide, and the bottom piece would be 11.5 inches wide. This would make for a 1/2-inch gap around the inside of the table, so I could keep and lay down the table leaves later on when the TV is not needed. Finally, the last part to design was the DM section. This one's pretty straightforward. I went with the simple 4-leg design, using deck posting again, with the same 5-inch gap for shelving, and also covering it on 3 sides with plywood. Simple, straightforward, but effective and does its purpose. Now for fabricating the plywood pieces. At this point, I would definitely need help. As I live in an apartment, I was able to build the TV box well enough with hand tools, but running a table saw in my apartment is another thing entirely. I knew I would be using 4-foot by 8-foot pieces of plywood, and figured that I would need an actual shop-sized table saw. According to DeWalt, the job site table saw is actually big enough to cut 4-foot by 8-foot pieces of plywood, and only $450. So, if you're not lucky enough to have a friend and access to a wood shop like me, that's always a viable option. Or, for an even cheaper option, if you're confident in your cutting abilities, You could use a circular saw with the plywood pieces supported on sawhorses for around $200. But I digress. Along with access to a proper wood shop, my friend also has a truck and helped to transport the plywood. And he's an actual professional who I could bounce my ideas off of for advice and tips. The plan: grab sheets of plywood, bring them to the shop, fabricate all the pieces, then drive them back to my place where I can assemble them, kind of like IKEA furniture. Good plan. So, along with the design measurements, I also wanted to go in knowing exactly what to cut on each piece of plywood. This would make sure I bought exactly enough pieces and didn't end up cutting myself into a corner or end up with too much waste and scraps. So, each piece I needed for the table, I mapped out onto a hypothetical sheet of 4 foot by 8 foot plywood, allowing me to know exactly what to cut on each piece on the day of the build. This step would be pretty unnecessary if I was cutting and assembling as I went, but in this case, I would be doing all the cuts and then all the assembly. So there was no margin for error. Measurements had to be within the millimeter, and I couldn't afford any major mistakes or oversights because once I had my pieces cut, that was what I was left with. So, along with checking all my measurements over several times, I also went over my design plans with my expert friend the night before fabrication. The first piece of advice my friend gave me was to frame up the tabletop with 2x4 pieces, so I had something to screw the top piece onto. I told him that wasn't necessary because I could screw into the 1/2 inch plywood pieces framing the whole top. This turned out to be a horrible mistake that I would have to fix later on, which leads me to my next tip. If you have no idea what you're doing, and you get a competent professional to help you on your project, you should actually listen to the help of the competent professional. The second piece of advice he gave me, I did listen to, but it led to an oversight. I designed the table out of 1/2 inch plywood because it made the measurements easier. He suggested that I make the top of the table out of 3/4 inch plywood because those thicker and nicer pieces will make for a better overall finished product. I'm really glad I listened to him about this because he was completely correct. And the 3/4 inch piece ended up being significantly nicer than it would have been had I stayed with my initial plan of a 1/2 inch top. But here's the oversight. Now I would be buying 4 pieces of 1/2 inch plywood and 1 piece of 3/4 inch plywood. And here's my cutting plan for each sheet of plywood. Do you see the oversight? For no reason in particular, I have the DM tabletop section on the piece of 1/2 inch plywood, and now one of the sides of the DM table is going to be 3/4 inches thick. So one side of the table is going to end up being a bit thicker than all the other sides, and the top of the DM section of the table is going to be a 1/4 inch thinner than the top of the player's side of the table. There's no design reason why I couldn't have just swapped these cuts around and ended up with a 3/4 inch thick top cut on the DM table and a proper thickness for all the pieces around the table. No design reason at all for this, just a complete oversight that I never realized until assembly. Now, it didn't completely ruin the finished table or anything, but just a reminder to be as diligent in your planning process as possible. And if you make any last minute changes, make sure to consider the impact on the whole project. The good news, though, is outside of that one oversight, the fabrication process went extremely well. I can't thank my friend enough for helping me transport the lumber, use his shop, teach me how to use the table saw, and do the difficult plunge cuts. Now that it was all in my apartment, it was time for assembly. Assembly started off really well, with screwing together the central base and TV box, along with the DM side of the table. At this point, I realized another oversight in my design process, although more of a minor one, and that's the grain pattern. I didn't consider the direction of the grain patterns in my cuts, so as you can see, it goes in different directions. It's not the end of the world, because it's just a bit of an aesthetic thing, and it becomes less noticeable when I put the wood stain on. But if I were to do this again, it's something I would consider in the design process when determining the cuts on each sheet of plywood, making sure the grain was all going in the same direction. Speaking of wood stain, it's about this part in the assembly process where my progress hit a brick wall because I decided to stain the table while assembling it. I absolutely do not recommend using an oil-based wood stain in a confined apartment like I did. Why did I do it? Well, I was going to stain it at my sister's house, but then I was going to get my friend to paint the table, but then that didn't pan out. So I ended up with all the pieces at my apartment and no easy way to transport them. The good news is I found a wood stain that would go on in one coat, so that reduced the total stain and drying time. I also found a black stain that matches the other furniture and shelves in my room really well. The bad news is I did this during a minus 40-degree cold snap, so I couldn't open my windows to air out my apartment, as my pipes would freeze. Luckily, I found a simple solution that actually worked really well to remove the fumes from the wood stain, and that's baking soda and vinegar. I laid out several plates of baking soda and opened several boxes, along with laying out bowls of vinegar, and within a day, all the fumes had disappeared. Just to confirm that this actually worked and I hadn't gone nose blind, I invited my friend over to test, and she said that she couldn't smell anything. So don't do what I do, but if you do, there's a solution. From this point forward, it was just a bit of a slow process of assembling, gluing, staining, waiting for everything to dry, and going again. Even though the fumes were dealt with, I wanted to give the stain a good 3 days to cure before manipulating them too much or applying a clear coat. I got the shelving parts glued into place and stained, and finally stained the top pieces. While waiting for all that to dry, I decided to work on the LED strip for the table. Initially, I wasn't going to put LEDs into the table, but I was inspired by this build from I Like to Make Stuff, where he uses LEDs to select players around the table during combat. I don't like LEDs for the sake of LEDs, but I absolutely loved this concept and stole this idea. Once the LED strip and Elegoo Uno arrived, I wired it all up and decided to test it and take some photos. Now for the second major oversight on this project. Do you see it? Things were working fine. Then suddenly, I pressed the button and it turned off. Was there an error in the code? Another button? Nothing. And another? Still nothing. Then, I noticed the lights on the Elegoo itself also went out. Then, smoke started to come out of the Elegoo. Of course, this genius put the unshielded Elegoo directly onto carpet, and it shorted out and destroyed itself. In a panic, I threw it into the snowbank outside and ordered an Arduino, vowing never to make that mistake ever again. Then, I noticed that the Arduino I ordered has a protective back on it. So I guess back onto the carpet you go. Enough of that, back to the table. By this point, the oil stain had cured enough to put on the protective urethane coating. To cut down on fumes, I decided to go with the water-based spar urethane to go on the tabletop and shelving parts, and then just use spray can shellac on the sides. Now, just needed to give all that time to dry before gluing the pieces together, as I didn't want the pressure from the clamps to ruin the finish. My original plan in the design phase was to screw down directly into the half-inch plywood that framed up the shelves to keep the top piece on. I realized though that I couldn't consistently and accurately screw down into the middle of these pieces, and I didn't want to end up ruining the supports by having the screws break out of the sides of the shelf. Did my friend warn me about not being able to do this? Yes. Did I listen to him? No. So, my idea was to use wood glue to keep it together instead of screws. But as I was waiting for the urethane to cure, I couldn't help but focus on the arc in the table. I knew this would happen as a result of just relying on a center base without the typical four legs, and I thought I could mitigate this by having part of the table rest on the TV itself and not having the full 11 inches overhang from the box. Even though there's only 7 inches hanging off the edge, and it did mitigate the problem, there was still more of a bend than I'd like to see. I didn't have much faith in my gluing abilities and the glue to hold the pieces together to remove the bend without it just falling apart on me. But screwing down the top wasn't an option, right? Well, had I listened to my friend in the first place and framed it out with 2x4 pieces, I could screw the top piece down into that. Of course, I didn't listen to his advice, so at this point I had to hack in a fix myself. I grabbed the scrap piece of 2x12 that I had laying around from when I built the TV box weeks ago, and cut out 4 chunks of wood that were roughly 4.5 inches long, then put one in each corner of the table. I glued and screwed from the bottom to keep them in place. Then, when I was ready to glue the top piece on, I lined everything up, screwed in the 4 corners into the makeshift framing posts, and clamped along the other edges to ensure a tight fit. At this point, the table was almost completely done. While I was waiting for the glue to set, I installed the aluminum channel for the LED light strips, screwed some holes into the tops and sides to run power and HDMI cables, and ironed on the edge banding. And so here it is, the final product. Or at least final for now. The nice thing about custom projects is you can always keep working on them later as needs arise. I still haven't been able to run a session on it yet, because all of my friends have been busy lately, but maybe once we've had a few sessions, we'll notice something that can change the table. Maybe I'll attach those foldable cup holders on the side that Nerd Immersion has on his table, after all. So, how do I feel about the table? Well, it's far from perfect. There were some oversights, as mentioned already. Lots of the edges don't line up perfectly, and some of the cuts were a bit off. The table leaves don't fit in perfectly either, leaving some gaps. But with all of that aside, I couldn't be happier with how it turned out. Especially as someone with not a lot of woodworking experience, any really, who designed and planned a table based on imagination, party needs, and inspiration from tables found online. I think it turned out better than it had any right to turn out. Of course, I did learn a lot while building the table, which will serve me well if I was going to do this again. Or maybe it can even help you before you start your project. Beyond what has already been mentioned, I think if there is one thing I might change, it's the dimension on the shelving. I went with 5-inch spacing, which is perfect when fully loaded, but ergonomically, I feel like it makes the tabletop just a little bit too high. Nothing super uncomfortable, but it might feel just slightly better if the tabletop was even a little bit lower, even 1 inch lower. Might even play around with 4.5-inch spacing for the shelving units, and then lower the base by 1/2 inch. That way it doesn't compromise legroom either. You know, upon reflection, I wasn't entirely honest at the start of this video. Sure, I didn't actually build the table until I was in a situation where I had no access to a printer, but that's not when I first thought about building the custom gaming table. In reality, I wanted to do this for years. And the exploration aspect of TTRPGs is fun, but it's not my favorite part of the game. My favorite part of the game is the collaborative storytelling nature of it, both between the players at the table and the game master. And I think the connection between these 2 points is no mere coincidence. There's something so primal and deeply ingrained in human nature about the importance and significance of humans in all societies and cultures throughout history, getting together and telling stories. Whether it be telling stories around the fire, orally reciting the Iliad and Odyssey for a crowd of people in ancient Greece, or narrating what happens when you fail a dex save while exploring the Tomb of Horrors, these stories simultaneously help to shape, and are shaped by, who we are, how we see the world, and how we see the world that we want to live in. The gaming table is not simply a wooden construction, but is in no small part the foundation of a tangible shared space where I am fortunate enough to get to share these stories with my friends every weekend. When I was building the table and explaining the design to people, most people thought it sounded cool. But a common response that I got was, well, we can do all that stuff by just playing online. Which is absolutely true, and there's nothing wrong with that. But in my humble opinion, in this modern age where we are paradoxically plugged into the internet 24/7, yet more isolated from our communities than we've ever been in history, sometimes it's nice to be able to unplug, sit around a table, and tell stories with your friends. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Kevbot. Now go out there and play a TTRPG.